Well, welcome back, folks. And if anybody's new, I'm Tony Knopp. I'm an emeritus professor of history at UTRGV, and I'm the vice president of the Brownsville Historical Association. And before I forget, because I do forget stuff, a common failing among older folks, right next door is a whole room devoted to the Mexican Revolution. Take the time to wander through there. You don't necessarily have to do it today, but pretty much any time you're over here, come on in and look it over, including the centerpiece is a big vehicle, I guess that's the only way to put it, that we believe belonged to Porfirio Diaz. And it was hidden away for many years and uncovered, and they drove it all the way up here, and we acquired it. The second thing that I hope I don't forget, so I'll bring it up now and pass it around. This gives you a little indication, I think, of the interest that Mexicans have in their history. This is a placemat from Cafe La Blanca in Mexico City. What it's devoted to is the departure of Porfirio Diaz when he left Mexico. And the fun photo that I think you might find entertaining, it shows him apparently in Egypt with his family. They must have gone to see the Sphinx and so on. So you can pass that around. I know the lighting's not real good, but you get a little look at it anyway. On the other hand, I do have a sheet that I used to pass around in my Mexican history classes that somebody in one of the newspapers in Mexico published, supposedly demonstrating the ignorance of Mexican students about their own history. You know, just like if you did, we've done the same thing in the U.S., passed around and asked people, students, what they know, and it turns out they don't know much of anything. Well, Mexican students weren't any particularly better about it. But the adults, there does seem to be a pretty strong interest in history. Today we're going to take a look at the Mexican Revolution. Oh, and next week, again, so I don't forget at the end of talking to you, I anticipate that the Mexican consul will be here. I sent a message to remind them that this was scheduled. I haven't heard back, but hopefully he will be here. And if he's not, I will find some other way to entertain you with some historical information. Well, and in all fairness, maybe I ought to ask, does anybody have any questions right off the bat? We'll see a little stuff first, a little information. Let's see here. Oh, Revolución Mexicana, the Mexican Revolution, 1910 to 1940. Certainly that would be the farthest extent that it's recognized. Some people feel that the violent era ended by 1920, so it's a matter of what you interpret as the Mexican Revolution. So we will certainly see it up to 1920 today, and we may see more depending upon how much time we have, etc. Here, of course, is President Porfirio Diaz. In his later years as president, he was over 80 when he left office. You may recall seeing in some of the earlier photos of Diaz when he was a young brigadier general and so on. Let's see. 1910 was the anniversary of Mexican independence. Kind of like the Americans celebrate the 4th of July, 1776. Now, of course, Americans did not obtain independence on the 4th of July, 1776, nor did the Mexicans obtain independence in 1910, and the 16th of September in 1910 But this is generally considered the beginning of independence. And you can see Diaz surrounded by some of his military, and there were parades and all kinds of events. People came from all over the world, not only to celebrate 100 years of Mexican independence, but also to celebrate Porfirio Diaz. He was very highly regarded in most quarters of the world for the success in bringing tranquility, or so it was believed, to Mexico. But the revolution is going to start the same year, what's called the Mexican Revolution. And I mentioned some of the factors last time, but let's look at them again. First of all, he was a dictator. He started out claiming that he had no re-election and so on and so forth, but inevitably he just stayed in office with one interruption from 1876 to 1910. So that's a pretty long time. And he certainly was a dictator. The term New Creoles there is basically the idea that upper class elements were in control. The Criollos, you may remember from the colonial era, were the white Spaniards who were born in Mexico. Well, these are obviously the upper class Mexicans. And a little list there does acknowledge that Mexico modernized, and that's why he got so much credit around the world. However, the masses were suppressed. Working class wages declined, although that's not really a fair statement. The wages didn't decline, but inflation began to have an impact. So they got paid the same, it's just that it became worth less as time went on. And the vast majority of rural people who were mestizos and Indians especially did not own any of their land that they worked on. Mestizo population grew rapidly after 1850. Mestizo, in case anybody's not acquainted with that term, is a mixture of white and Indian blood. And that's the predominant numbers in Mexico are mestizo today, and have been for some time. Oh, and the thing I told you last time, why did the Mexican Revolution occur, just to reiterate it, I think it's because the regime got too old and was no longer dynamic. It was no longer creating new opportunities and making things better in Mexico, because it was a bunch of old men, and that's me speaking as one. Not looking for any great change. They reach a point in life where you're happy with what you are at and you don't want to change things. And that's fine, as long as you're not president of Mexico and a dictator. And we just kind of covered those. Here you see some of the figures who are involved in the Mexican Revolution. You may recognize the first three, I think, but we're going to see the others as we go along here. This is just kind of a quick look at them, the people who were prominent figures of the Mexican Revolution. A precursor, somebody who came before, somebody who wanted to try to bring about a revolution but failed because they started too early. And that's the Flores Magón brothers. Ricardo and Enrique Flores Magón were two of three brothers who were involved in running newspapers that were critical of Diaz. Well, finally they were told, you know, you get out or you'll get killed. And they left and came up to the United States and published their newspaper, Regeneración, which had some influence in stirring up what became the eventual revolution. And over in Matamoros today, the high school over there, one closest, I think, to the bridge is Ricardo Flores Magón. high school. So this is a little poster representing Regeneración and the members of the Flores Magón family and their allies who were involved in that. There's even a board game out now on Tierra y Libertad, the revolutionary game. Join with the revolution, fight for noble ideals of justice, and convert yourself into the greatest revolutionary of Mexico. So that's an example, I think, of the impact that the revolution still has, that you have a popular board game. Mexican leaders that you're going to see here. First of all, one who replaces Diaz and who led the revolution against him is Francisco Madero. But he doesn't last long, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. He's replaced by Victoria Huerta, who was really, that's kind of inaccurate. He didn't come in 1911, he came in 1912. He was more inclined towards the Diaz dictatorial approach. And he gets pushed out, and Venustiano Carranza ultimately comes to power in Mexico and was president until 1920. 1916 would be more accurate than 1920. And then Alvaro Obregón kind of brings an end to the more violent phase of the revolution. Well, that's just a brief, quick overview. Here are the northern rebels. By the way, there were several factions in Mexico that didn't always work together. And this was probably the predominant element here. And you can see them over here. Let's see, here's Carranza, Venustiano Carranza. Let me get over him here. And Madero, this was a man who was involved in the very earliest phase of the revolution. Pascual Orozco was another one involved in the early phase. Let's see, Garibaldi back there. He was an Italian related to the independence of Italy. His father, I believe, has been involved in it. Let's see, and then there's Pancho Villa over far on the left. I'm not sure that that's Lucio Blanco. It doesn't look like him, so I'm not going to push him. Somebody named Blanco there. It will be a little clearer about who all these people are as we go along, but this is just an attempt to introduce them to you. Emiliano Zapata is one of the most famous. Tierra y Libertad was his slogan, land and liberty. That was the most important thing. If the people have the land for themselves, that is liberty from his perspective. Oh, I've got several pictures of Zapata here. Okay. Village leader, farmer, and horseman. By that, he was kind of an expert on horses and supposedly had a personal interview with Porfirio Diaz at one point. He was an important figure in the state of Morelos, which is the first state south of Mexico City. And he had been elected mayor of Amenequilco, tiny town he was born in, rounded up armed peasants and forcefully take back land that they were being deprived of, or that people had supposedly cheated them out of. Let's see, I know I've got more here. This is a classic Zapata pose, I think, with the rifle and the sword. And this is Diego Rivera, famous Mexican muralist. This is his version of Emiliano Zapata. I think the horse tends to dominate the painting, however. Zapata came the closest to being a pure revolutionary who really didn't seem to have any ulterior motives involved. Consequently, he was very much loved by the people who supported him. And when there was an uprising in the state of Chiapas about 20 years ago, they called themselves Zapatistas in recognition of the revolutionary efforts of Emiliano Zapata. Oh, but he's, as I said, from the south, below Mexico City. He doesn't have anything to do with those guys from the north. See, they're entirely separate operation, operating independently, no coordination really at all in the beginning. And here you see the leaders from at the early phase: Francisco Madero, Emiliano Zapata, and Pancho Villa. Villa is another one who was operating independently up in the northwest of Mexico, the states of Chihuahua and Sonora particularly. And he doesn't come out of the peasant class exactly, kind of a working middle class type of background. Very dynamic and charismatic, as most of these leaders were. Here, Pancho Villa, on horseback, a standard look, standard appearance. Here's a bandera, the Villista flag, cuerpo, the body of the army of the north, Jefe Supremo, the chief, General Francisco Villa. But the man who led the opposition to Diaz and tried to run for president against him was Francisco Madero. Now, how do you run for president against a dictator? And the answer is, it doesn't work out very well. Needless to say, he lost and wound up in prison in San Luis Potosí. But, and historians differ on this, he either escaped or was allowed to escape, and came up to San Antonio, where he published the Plan de San Luis Potosí, as though he had written it while he was in San Luis. And in it he called for the ouster of Diaz. That was the whole point. And called for the revolution to begin November, I think it was, of 1910. And the revolution began on the day it was supposed to, October 23rd, I think that's the date. He had a revolution in Mexico. And Noviembre, sí. 23 de noviembre. 20 de noviembre. 20th of November. So this was the announcement, everybody's supposed to rise up. Well, practically nobody did, except the Achilles Cerdán family in Puebla. The day came for the revolution, and they got their rifles and stuck them out the windows of their house and started shooting. Well, that didn't last very long either, needless to say. The Achilles Cerdán family was largely bumped off by the police and military. But what it did do was kind of start people beginning to make some efforts. Pancho Villa, for example, and Emiliano Zapata, these are people who recognized that call and began to organize in one little town, and then they get some rifles and they take control of another little town, more rifles, more men. Gradually the numbers expanded. Let's see. Ultimately, thanks to the efforts of Pancho Villa and Pascual Orozco and the capture of what today is known as Ciudad Juarez, which is right below El Paso, you know, the city, twin city to El Paso. When that city was captured, that's when Porfirio Diaz decided to leave. He felt that, well, we're not sure exactly what he felt. Whether he felt he was going to lose or whether he felt it would result in too much chaos, we don't know. But anyway, when that happened, the capture of Ciudad Juarez, then Diaz leaves and an election is held, and here's Madero in triumph. I think this is when he came into the city, into Mexico City, before he was elected president. But he was elected president. Let's see.
But then he was executed?
Well, murdered, I think, might be a more legitimate way of putting it. Madero was not a highly competent president. He was, we believe, an honest man and good principles, but he was not a very effective leader. And when things didn't change dramatically for, let's say, the people in Morelos state, where Zapata was from, all those guns and so on which had been put down were taken up again, and you had more trouble. And Francisco Madero is not a military leader, really. He has to rely on the old Diaz army to put down the brush fire troubles that were occurring in several places in Mexico. And the leader of the army that he chose to do that was Victoriano Huerta, who was a pretty good military person, but not one having any great sense of loyalty to Madero. I hope this doesn't get too confusing. You know, I always told my students, well, you know, if it gets confusing and problem for you, just blame it on the Mexicans. They're the ones that did it. You know, this was their story, and I can't do anything other than tell you how it went. At any rate, ultimately, Huerta came back to Mexico City and got together with Diaz's nephew, and they got put in prison, as a matter of fact. They were considered potential troublemakers and disloyal and so on. But some members of the military broke them out of this prison known as the Ciudadela. It's about, since I've walked it so many times, about a mile from the Zocalo, from the heart of, maybe a little longer than that, but not much more. And they began attacking the soldiers that were loyal to Madero. And that began La Decena Trágica, the tragic 10 days of artillery shelling in the heart of Mexico City. Well, you can imagine how dangerous and deadly that kind of thing could be. Finally, Huerta took power. Finally, Huerta just went in and took Madero as prisoner. Madero was put in a prison, as a matter of fact. And was shot while attempting to escape. Well, we don't believe that for a minute. We think it was set up to, car pulls up at the prison and they're going to move him, and while they're moving him, he gets shot and killed, along with his vice president, Pino Suarez. So Huerta's in power, but here's was the second time when my students would, oh no, not another revolution, you know. Well, sure enough, elements in Mexico loyal to Madero rise up in opposition to Huerta. They are known as the Constitutionalists, and they were led by, I don't know if I've got it at this point, let's see, yeah, Venustiano Carranza. Here you can see the two men who were opposed to each other. Venustiano Carranza, a governor of Saltillo State up in the northern part of Mexico, and he organizes the Constitutionalist Army, loyal to the Constitution, opposing Huerta. But Huerta pretty much solidifies his power. He's able to hand control of most of the country, or at least a good section of it. Also opposing Huerta was Emiliano Zapata. But Zapata's operating completely independently in the state of Morelos and the surrounding area. So there's intermittent fighting, including, I might mention, here in Matamoros, when a constitutionalist army moves along the border, led by General Lucio Blanco, and ultimately attacks Matamoros, which had the military commander there was a loyalist to Huerta. And there was fighting in the streets. A lot of people, a number of people killed. People in Brownsville went down by the, well, back then it was the only bridge, and to watch, and occasionally duck bullets. There were people in El Paso who got killed watching the fighting going on over in Ciudad Juarez. I didn't read of anybody being killed watching the fighting here. General Blanco's forces captured Matamoros, but the Federales, the federal forces, loyal to Huerta, managed to escape, most of them, by crossing the bridge. If this had happened a couple years earlier, they wouldn't have made it. There wouldn't have been any bridge. And they were interned here at Fort Brown because you couldn't allow competitive military forces to just operate back and forth across the border whenever they wanted to. So they were interned here temporarily at Fort Brown. Here's another figure who plays a prominent role in both the Constitutionalist Army and in Mexico leadership for a good many years. This is General Alvaro Obregón. He's from the state of Sonora, and a very competent military leader, it turns out. But at this point, he's just commanding one of the Constitutionalist armies in the north. Now, the famous Nadirita. And this is it looks like a woodcut to me. Here's the original photo. I'll be going down to Puerto Vallarta in a couple weeks, and there's a nightclub downtown with a giant Adelita there. It's called a statue or something, utilized to enhance the nightclub scene. Interestingly. Pardon?
Where is that?
Puerto Vallarta.
Dr. Knopp, the Sheriff Days poster for this year
Has an Adelita.
They are free. They're just beautiful by Don Reed.
Yeah, you can get them at the Chardonnay's headquarters just down Elizabeth.
And she's a teacher.
Pardon?
The person that posed with the picture is a
Yes.
teacher in high school.
Yes, they actually used a real person to pose for this.
Were they fighters?
Well, that's the point. Let me move on here.
Wow.
Soldaderas. They were known as soldaderas.
I'll say.
And although this is largely exaggerates the role of women fighters in the revolution, they were more, played a role of helping. There were no great supply trains coming along, you know, for the soldiers. The women were the ones that provided all that, the support, the supplies, taking care of the men. They traveled with the men, and when needed to, they took up rifles and fired them. And so thus came the image of the soldaderas. And certainly there were some that were active fighters and that even played some leadership, minor leadership roles.
Where did they get the name?
From soldiers?
Adelita.
Oh, the Adelita, no, I don't know.
You know, there's a song.
There's a
Yeah.
song, yeah, it's a folk song.
Probably based on the song. That was, I think it was the Eastas that used that, where that music came from. That's right. I thought I ought to put in some of the men too. Here's the Zapatista leadership, and notice the cross bandoleros. These were fighters. And if this is Emiliano Zapata here, then this is probably Eufemio, his brother. And that triggers off another thing that I ought to mention to you. If you haven't seen it, watch Viva Zapata when it comes on television one of these times. This is the movie about Emiliano Zapata starring Marlon Brando as Zapata. And it's a good movie. And Anthony Quinn plays Eufemio. And much of it was filmed, anybody know where? Roma, in Roma, Texas. Yeah, they've got, just like we're used from time to time, Brownsville as a Mexican place, Mexican location. Roma was used for whatever town thought they were filming or they were acting in. And it still looks that way today. They've repaired a lot of the buildings and so on, but the buildings certainly gave you the flavor of late 19th century Mexico at that point. This is, yeah, I had to put another heading up there, temporary victory. Notice the revolution concludes. Well, it by no means concluded. Huerta finally found himself too much opposition, too many forces arrayed against him. Opposition from President Wilson in the United States, and finally the Huerta left. There had been an intervention even by the United States in 1914. I did my doctoral dissertation on public opinion regarding that intervention. It was President Wilson sending American forces to take Veracruz to stop weapons from reaching Huerta. Actually, it did not stop the weapons from reaching Huerta. And I think if there was a purpose, and we're never sure with President Wilson exactly what he wanted to do, it did have the effect of stopping Huerta from getting money. Because all the taxes from the imports, that all came from Veracruz. You seize Veracruz, then you cut the dictator off from his money supply. And that's another reason why Huerta ultimately had to leave. I've been in Veracruz numerous times, And right on the Malecon, the kind of waterfront drive area, there's a group of statuary showing one man with a machine gun and another couple with guns, I believe. And these are representing the military cadets that were killed during the American attack on Veracruz. There were approximately 20 Americans that were killed and about 200 Mexicans during the attack on Veracruz. And the Americans were there for about 7 months, and ultimately evacuated. So,
And excuse me, and I think how well my grandparents are from Veracruz.
Oh, really?
And I remember that my grandma was very young at that time when they came, and from there on they called them gringos because it was green go. That's the term. So my grandma used to tell me that everybody was mad and they didn't want them to come, so they called them green go. That's why the term comes.
Yet another example of that term. Yeah, needless to say, the American patriotic Mexicans were not happy with the American invasion there. So, Villa and Zapata, Wilson sided. Yeah, President Wilson sided with Carranza, because once Huerta's gone, then who takes over? You know, well, Carranza was the theoretically political leader in the north, but Zapata didn't like him. Pancho Villa didn't trust him. So there was a lot of hostility. Villa, as a matter of fact, met with, you can see there, General Pershing at one point. This is before the First World War. And over here is Obregón, when he still had both arms, it appears. And let me see. Anybody know who this is? I'm having trouble calling it.
Pershing?
No, this is Pershing.
Yeah, or the one behind him.
Yeah, that's the tricky part, isn't it? That's George S. Patton. That's General Patton. When he was still a staff member for Pershing's Army, way back in 1913, 1914, something like that. Yeah.
He's a pattern from World War II.
Yeah, that's George S. Patton. Well, the revolutionaries split among themselves, and here's where I'd hear a sigh of, oh, how are we going to remember all this stuff from the test, from the students? Zapata coming from the south and Villa from the north joined forces in the capital. They took Mexico City. And here you see, this is a very famous photo. You see Villa sitting in the presidential chair. I sat in that chair for about 3 seconds before I was afraid somebody would catch me sitting in it in Chapultepec Castle, where at last I knew where it resided. And sitting next to him, of course, is Emiliano Zapata. And they had a famous meeting when they first got together. And, you know, neither one was well-spoken particularly. But Villa Zapata supposedly said something negative about Carranza. And Villa, oh, he's a son of a bitch. And, oh, well, okay, now we see things alike, and we both hate Carranza. However, these guys are military people, and they lack administrative skills and knowledge. and they're not able to hold Mexico City. As time goes by, they're forced to evacuate. Zapata doesn't want to stay up there anyway. He wants to go back to his home territory south of Mexico City. Villa, on the other hand, is kind of compelled to leave because the Carranza forces are getting stronger. And it all culminated in actually a series of battles. It says here battles, so actually there were about 5 battles that occurred between the Villistas and Carranza's army under Obregón.
That's a photograph.
Obregón had already picked up the techniques of modern warfare from the beginning of the fighting in Europe. The digging of trenches and barbed wire out in front of the trenches and machine guns along the barbed wire. And when Pancho Villa's famous Dorados would attack, these were cavalry, they'd get shot to pieces. And they were. Villa's army, in essence, disintegrated. Not disappeared, but factions of it were still around. Villa himself headed back north. Where is he going? Where's his home? Chihuahua, Sonora area. Yeah. And Carranza then takes control and becomes president. He serves from 1916 up to 1920 as sort of as an interim president. And during that time, a constitution is drawn up in Mexico, the Constitution of 1917, which Carranza didn't like very much, as a matter of fact. Thought it was too radical in some respects. But they did get a constitution. That's the constitution that's still in effect today. Much modified. Carranza, geez, you know, people who get power have a lot of trouble giving it up. And by 1920, when an election was supposed to occur, Carranza really didn't want to depart from the scene. He wanted to install what many people believe was a puppet. And when that happened, the men of Sonora, Álvaro Obregón, Plutarco Elias Calles, and Adolfo de la Huerta, 2 of whom you see here, and you already saw Obregón, these guys rose up in rebellion. And under the Plan de Agua Prieta, no point in getting into that. It's the justification for overthrowing Carranza. And these guys have the strength, the military strength, and Carranza flees on a train headed for Veracruz, but gets trapped along the way and killed. All the leaders of the revolution of 1910 die by violence. All the great leaders. Here's Adolfo de la Huerta. He was interim president for about 8 months, something like that. And an election took place. And Obregón was elected president for a 4-year term. Under the Constitution, no immediate re-election. And I give Obregón a lot of credit for consolidating the revolution at this point, bringing stability to Mexico, which it desperately needed at this point, and providing effective leadership of a relatively moderate nature. He was not inclined towards the more extreme elements, and were pretty effective. Well, let me stop there. Right, no. And see, are there any questions? Yes.
About what year was, excuse me,
Go.
about what year was everyone, more or less?
What year was he
Yeah.
president?
Yeah, more or less.
1920 to 24.
What is your feeling that Obregón towards the church those 4 years?
Yeah, he wasn't terribly concerned. The revolution takes a turn against the church, but that occurs primarily under his successor, Calles, rather than Obregón.
Calles and Obregón were
Yes, they were close allies, but it's just that Calles was more hostile to the church than Obregón was.
talking about the Catholic Church.
Yes, clearly the Catholic Church. Anything else? Yes.
That raid by Villa into New Mexico, Columbus, New Mexico, was that a significance of any kind?
I should mention that as long as we're at it. And thank you for raising that question. Yes, there was a second American intervention in Mexico in 1916 after Villa. Remember I said his army disintegrating and he heads back up north? Well, it must have been to try to revive his fortunes that he crossed the border into the little town of Columbus, New Mexico, shot it up pretty good. There was an American military force there. Small, but there was one there. And he had about 500 men. We know he was there. We don't think he actually entered the town himself. But a number of people were killed, and he retreated back into Mexico, and President Wilson ordered General Pershing to take an American force to capture Villa, and went into Chihuahua and chased Villa for quite some time. Villa was very elusive. They never caught him. They did hit a couple of Villista bands of men, and things began to quiet down along the border as a result of the Pershing expedition, but they never caught Pancho Villa. And that only added to his legend. The gringos couldn't catch him. Anything else? Yes.
The U.S. didn't join World War I until 1917. Is that partially because of the War with Mexico?
No, I don't think so. I think it was Wilson's commitment to peace, for one thing. He had a very strong belief that hostile to wars, even though he initiated a couple of adventures in Mexico, in all fairness. No, I don't think that was a factor. It is one of the factors in withdrawing the American forces that were chasing Pancho Villa. They were withdrawn, and oh, by the way, the National Guard was elevated or called up because of the Pershing expedition into Mexico. They brought them down here, well, all along the border, and here, including in Brownsville, there were 25,000 National Guard, and they got some important training for their eventual involvement in World War I, as a matter of fact. So in one sense, it was kind of a useful development. And, well, why did they call them up and bring them down here? Fear that the Mexicans would attack along the border. I mean, a lot of Americans were very concerned, especially those living along the border, that there might be some Mexican raids or attacks across the border. And indeed, there had been, a year earlier, there had been an episode involving what's called the Plan de San Diego, which was supposedly something where it involved calling on Mexican Americans to kill the gringos, and then there was some raids that occurred, and then the Texas Rangers got sent down here, and these were not what you call the professional level Texas Rangers. These were some cronies of the governor, Pa Ferguson, at that time. And these guys, some of them were scoundrels. Anyway, there was a lot of killing that went on down here in South Texas. But a lot of it related to just the fact that you had this violence going on cross-border and along the border back in that era. Let's see, what else we got here. In 1924, President Obregón steps aside and Plutarco Elias Calles is elected president. He's another one of the men of Sonora, close ally of Obregón. And he's the one that initiated the church-state conflict.
You mentioned the statues there in Veracruz of the young. Weren't those students at that naval academy?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, is that one of the oldest naval academies, or the only one that Mexico had, or something like that?
Yeah, at Antonizado, which is just south of Veracruz a little bit. I went to visit it, this is a number of years ago, and I was very impressed. The buildings were nothing special, they were brick buildings. But the way that place was run and the behavior that I observed there, it gave me a very favorable impression towards the Mexican Navy. We got there with a bunch of students from Texas Southmost, I think it was at the time. And there's a main building, and as we're going up the step, there's a guy coming out, and of course they're all dressed in white, that's the naval uniform. But one older guy coming out, and he's like, well, where are you from? And it turns out he was an admiral in the Mexican Navy. And when you got in that building, we didn't go in because there's only limited access. To the right is a hall, and there are two cadets always right at the front of that hall, and at the far end of it are the portraits of the naval personnel who were killed during the American intervention in Veracruz. There's a permanent honor guard for those cadets. So, when I was working on my dissertation, they had taped interviews with people from Veracruz who remembered and lived through that experience. And then they had, written them out so I could read them. Transcripts, thank you. And reading through the transcripts, they would say, and here they broke off because the person started crying. So frustrated at the inability to do anything to stop the Americans from taking over in Veracruz. A very frustrating and humiliating experience for the people there, as indicated. Well, I think I'll at least get started on this topic. Notice this is a picture of Calles. Calles, the persecutor. And notice it's in English. I would be happy to remove useless files if I could. Here's this whole story, the story of the Cristero Revolt. There's a movie was made a few years ago about it, called For Greater Glory, which I think gives certainly a very sympathetic portrayal of the Cristero movement. At any rate, I wish I knew how to get rid of that.
Exit it out over here, can you bring that
That's the catch. Oh, there it is.
way over here to the far right?
Yeah, now that I knew where it was.
Whoa.
Jessica sent me 3 photos.
You might want to close that one
It's because sometimes you think you exit out, but they don't leave.
I didn't know she knew where I was.
No, don't hit
You have a virus.
Apparently,
She's persistent.
can't get rid of it.
Their virus. It's a Trojan.
No. Well, it's good enough that we're at the close of the session. We'll get this repaired in better shape. This movement against the persecution. What was the persecution? I'll introduce that to you before we close. Persecution involved limiting the number of priests that would be allowed in Mexico, excluding all foreign priests, and shutting down of any kind of Christian activity, basically. The churches would remain open, and the priests that were native Mexican presumably could serve, but they were not supposed to have any involvement in public affairs whatsoever. In other words, Catholic priests were not supposed to have the right to vote, participate in any way, and this led to and plus the general oppression of the Catholics led to an armed rebellion known as the Cristiada, the Cristero Rebellion. And
Dr. Knopp, is that when the priests were not allowed to wear?
clerical garb. Yeah, I don't know, I can't remember, it was during this period that that set in, but I don't recall exactly when that happened. I admit that I spent enough time in Mexico that a few years ago, maybe, I don't know, when they began to allow priests to wear clerical garb again, I was stunned the first time I saw a couple priests with the Roman collar on at the airport in Monterrey. So I was like, what? You know, what's this? So, very...
I ran into this earlier. What somebody's trying to send us stuff. The Norton's protection is intercepting it, but it's telling me that it's blocking it, but I don't really care. I really don't want this stuff popping up. But if you don't mind leaving that one up, that's a little bit less.
Well, we're just going to stop now anyway.
And so I'm going to have to kind of shut this down and get in there and see if I can't turn the notifications.
Is this your own private computer, David?
No, actually, this did not start doing this until I took it in and had a new operating system. And apparently it got infected with something.
There's an issue with your
Well, it's not
firewall.
really infected, but it has to do with Norton's saying that somebody's trying to invade you. Here's what it is. And rather than just saying I stopped it, it's been explicit.
Because they were saying that the virus was expired.
It's not a virus, it's not letting it in, but somebody's trying to attack and it's stopping it.
Yeah.
But it's notifying me that it's stopping it.
There was a Norton notification first,
Right.
and when we closed that, then these started coming up. So
Yeah.
they're trying to like say, well, you better do something with Norton or else we're going to keep on sending this stuff.
Well, Norton's is stopping it, just, I had turned notifications off before, but for some reason they're back on. So anyway.
Okay. Hopefully that will all be solved
We
by
can take care of
next
it.
time. As I say, we're scheduled to have the Mexican consul. I'm going to check again. Hopefully he'll be able to come. I asked if I could ask him some questions about Mexican history, his perspective on Mexican history. And if he can't make it for whatever reason, he does have some health issues. We will proceed to look at the Cristiada and the remainder of the period up to 1940 and even begin to look at the period after that. Hope to see you next week. See you later.